Buenas, mi nombre es Ernesto Oroza, yo soy
Good morning, my name is Ernesto Oroza, I'm an artist and designer, and I am an investigative writer. I'm very happy to be here to do this talk. I'm very thankful to INSTAR to be able to talk about Documenta. I wanted to take advantage to announce that tomorrow we will have a conversation about new graphic Cuban new graphics from Cuba with other artists with the same schedule. Before anything, I would like to be thankful. I would like to be thankful for the people who will be acting today. This is a text that I have written. It's about my work about recent years. I'm trying to appeal a declaration from Fidel Castro. He declared that inside the revolution, this text discusses 3 spontaneous computer-based protocols that took shape and became systemized in Cuba over the last 20 years. It's about digital practices that have antecedents in the past decades and private productive processes and are popularly known as Paquete Semanal or the weekly package, SNet, StreetNet, acá Revolico, aka the Republic of Gamers and Revolico. This is about the same principles It's about the same principles that are communitarian and anti-monopolistic. This is of confrontative character.
La respuesta del gobierno con el auspicio de los mismos funcionarios de cultura que paradójicamente defienden formas de emancipación y soberanía tecnológica en otros contextos ha sido coartarlas por la fuerza, decomisos de medios o por medios de apropiaciones de sus infraestructuras y penalizaciones legales. Por su parte, los gestores
There has been emancipatory forms and technological sovereignty in other contexts. We have been restricted through legal penalties and appropriation of infrastructures. Cultural production over the last 2 decades in Cuba has been captured, shot through, and interconnected in other way or another with the use of these digital protocols that became social phenomena. This text goes over a few of these connections, the Paquete Semanal, and domestic spaces that had already been reformulated by other phenomena of vernacular production. I'm specifically referring to what I have documented, analyzed, and synthesized as the architecture of necessity and technological disobedience.
En ambas síntesis hago énfasis en 2 rasgos que son comunes a los fenómenos que presentaré después. Me refiero al principio de intrarred y la noción de estar dentro. La primera de las prácticas estudiadas anteriormente impacta el hábitat y el espacio urbano. Se trata de transformaciones constructivas de la vivienda por parte de sus habitantes para adaptarlas a las nuevas
These transformations are ongoing and mostly illegal.
La construcción familiar o por
It
medios
has
propios,
modes
así
of
como la
adapting the
única
habitat
respuesta
established by way of building sections and nodes that extends across
Estas
time.
transformaciones, aún en curso y en gran proporción ilegales, permiten alojar en una vivienda hasta 4 generaciones de la misma familia. El término que he usado para nombrar estas complejas e interminables secuencias de adaptaciones es arquitectura de la necesidad. Con el uso del término, me propongo que las construcciones se entiendan como diagramas edilicios de las relaciones entre necesidades y recursos legales, económicos, intelectuales, tecnológicos y materiales.
We're trying to unify intellectual resources, material, hydraulic, and technical sources
formas de adaptación del hábitat asentaron una manera de edificar por tramos
to change the habitats of people and adapt
se
them.
extiende en el tiempo y se actualiza de forma improvisada. Pero ha sido la
We do it in an improvised way.
Así como los impedimentos legales para su realización, lo que consolidó este principio productivo de edificación por segmentos y momentos. Una de las formas de ampliación del espacio de la vivienda en este tipo de arquitectura es la ocupación de los espacios comunes y públicos. Por esta razón, las edificaciones transformadas terminan por toparse entre ellas en el espacio común, estableciéndose nuevos intersticios para la circulación al interior de las manzanas y con esto lugares inesperados para el encuentro comunal. La información sobre dónde conseguir materiales y la relativa a conocimientos legales y técnicos para transformar las casas.
The transformed buildings end up running into one another and establishing new interstices for circulation within the block. This in turn creates unexpected places for communal meetings. Information about where to get building materials as well as the legal technical knowledge for transforming houses flows among the inhabitants since the unaltered architecture is generally standardized. If one person learns how to carry out the modification, all people learn how to do it. The second phenomena that took national proportions and which I call technological disobedience is made up of a set of practices developed by Cuban families during the economic crisis during the 90s. These forms of production had their origin in practices initiated in the 60s that were meant to reopen the factories that had been paralyzed due to lack of spare parts and the exodus to the USA and other countries. Individuals acting both independently and collectively assume the responsibility of ensuring their family's survival. The period of family reproduction continues to this day. Repair, reuse, and a kind of typological reinvention are few of the practices analyzed and documented under the idea of technological disobedience. The use of the word disobedience appeals to the Cuban individuals' continuous disrespect for the closed and exclusive image of the contemporary industrial object. Repair questions the industrial object and its culture from an artisanal perspective. The logics of circulation and use inscribed in these objects are permanently challenged. The open objects to be repaired infinitely and the spare parts that overflow like entrails from the shop windows of the state and the portable tables of the black market invite us to think of the city as a continuous technical interior. Technology, in the term technological disobedience, is understood as an unquestionable knowledge and truth and is
que incluye la participación de todos los miembros de la familia en la producción, experiencia en prácticas colaborativas, comunitarias y vecinales, lógicas económicas y comunicativas, casi dialectales, para el intercambio de bienes y servicios, atajos hacia fuentes de recursos casi siempre legales.
Within the infrastructure of this productive experience, we include the participation of all family members in production, experience with collaborative, communal, and neighborhood practices. Logics that are economic and communicative, almost dialectical, for the exchange of goods and services. Shortcuts to resource suppliers, almost always illegal, and the constant arrival of technical and computational knowledge. I'm going to start with the Paquete Semanal. In 1990, using CIMIX, the biggest government-owned import-export company, as a front, the Cuban Ministry of the Interior set up an intelligence operation in the U.S. city of Ocala, near Orlando, to acquire a parabolic satellite antenna measuring 7 meters in diameter. It was the biggest antenna on the market at the time. According to a protagonist of the operation who was interviewed for this investigation, satellite transmissions were new in those years. Showtimes and CNN, among others, had recently begun offering encrypted satellite television. The United States embargo against the island prohibited the direct purchase of the receiver. The buyer sent by the Cuban government claimed to be living in Key West, Florida. The seller packed up the enormous antenna, including the rotor for pointing it, and sent it by truck to Miami. From the Cuban agent sent it to Panama and then on to Havana, where it was finally installed in the yard of the capital's Playa municipality, two specifically. It was set up on 222nd Street between 7th and 9th Avenues, where Publicitaria Imágenes was set up and remains to this day. The first attempts at getting the satellite signal from Havana failed. The program that came with the antenna required precise information. The person who had acted as the buyer called the provider in Ocala and gave him the coordinates of the residence in Havana so the seller could give him the exact degrees by which to orient the antenna, so that the location in Cuba would not remain recorded in the transaction documents. The buyer told the seller he had mistaken the latitude and immediately gave him the latitude of Key West.
Algunos técnicos extranjeros y personal diplomático radicado en La Habana se favorecieron de este servicio pirata.
Some foreign technicians and diplomatic staff based in Havana took advantage of this pirating service, stimulated by the benefits and the ease of operations of pirating and copying. CIMIX created a company called Omni Video Corp, registered in Panama, with the objective of commercializing North American movies throughout Latin America. To this end, they set up a production system that included the services of translation and subtitling, classification of fiction movies and documentaries, as well as the manufacture, design, and printing of the cardboard sleeves, on the back of which Carlos Aldana, Raul Castro's assistant, had to add summaries of the video included per his boss's wishes.
De que este contenido circulara abiertamente entre la población, por lo que controlaban a los operarios de video y los emisarios.
Aware of the risk of content circulating openly among the population, the high command of the government controlled the video workers and messengers, but the overflow could not be contained, and it led to the emergence of two vernacular systems for the circulation of audiovisual materials. Known in the 80s and 90s as video banks, based on VHS rentals and cable, a system on the neighborhood scale that connected several televisions to a single video player or parabolic antenna via coaxial cables for a price that fluctuated between $10 and $20 a month. None of these practices were authorized by the government, but they made use of the same resources and illegal activities that the government did. The delivery drivers that worked for the ministerial and military elite were the main leaks of the audiovisual content before arriving at their destinations. The drivers would stop somewhere so that the material could be copied. The entrance of North American cinema and television probably occurred behind the backs of a group of Cuban intellectuals who, like Julio Garcia Espinosa, author of For an Imperfect Cinema, were simultaneously debating and developing critical theories about the need to produce and consume revolutionary cinema, as well as calling for a critical frame of presentation for the audiovisual materials produced in capitalist societies. For a few shows of this sort have been very popular in Cuban television since then. A presenter before the film plays puts forth a critical and historical analysis of the materials and its authors for the spectator, trying, though not always successfully, and without giving any spoilers.
Mediante su pago en divisas podían rentar películas. Si el derrame de audiovisuales por medio de cassette fue importante, también lo fue el rápido proceso de replicación satelitales, primero por el propio gobierno y después por la población. Al principio del año 2003 entraron a los espacios domésticos cubanos discos duros.
At the beginning of 2003, hard drives that could be connected directly to television sets to play their contents, multimedia hard drives, MHD, enter domestic Cuban spaces. This external disk almost always brought illegally from Miami, came with a remote control for selecting and playing with their content. DVDs were becoming more and more available in the illegal distribution circuits, but it was not until 2007 when the Minister of Finance and Prices repealed resolution number 322, which had prohibited the entry of content players into the country. With resolution number 99, 2007, Gaceta Official de la República de Cuba. These events, along with the transition of content to digital formats, favored the development of what is known today as the Paquete Semanal, the weekly package.
En la isla se hizo frecuente el uso de antenas parabólicas ilegales escondidas en tanques de agua, en azoteas y jaulas para aves cubiertas que recibían uno o muy pocos canales y sus dueños vendían sus descargas a los organizadores del paquete.
On the island, frequent use was made of illegal parabolic antennas that received just one or a few channels. These were hidden in rooftop or water tanks and covered bird cages. The sources that have historically contributed content to the Paquete Semanal have been diverse, which is why the documented attempts at finding the people responsible for it never get beyond the first analysis.
Tras previo acuerdo, llega a tu casa cada lunes, casi siempre los primeros días de la semana, cargando un disco duro.
El paquetero or the distributor would arrive in your house almost once a week. Or he would come in a bicycle. You would not see him the next time. He would only come on Mondays, almost always on the first days of the week. You could have everything: telenovelas, TV shows, cómicos, memes, cartoons, apps, antivirus, juegos, and ads for local businesses, as well as an offline version of the ads on the website Revolico, among many other materials. When you're downloading, you call someone on the phone, but you do not speak. The person you call shows up at your house and you hand over the 1 terabyte drive, but not before you insert the payment for the service in the hard drive case's pocket. The person leaves, completing the operation. Then they call the next person, give them the drive, and later add their payment. After about 15 people have done this, the last one to do so calls or gets a message to the paquetero, the individual that arrived by bicycle at the start of the sequence. People would rather ensue the survival of the project than confront the regime.
En los últimos años, el paquete se le presentó figuras en contrapunteo: la mochila y el paquetico. La mochila se lanzó el 27 de noviembre del 2017.
During the last couple of years, the paquete was confronted by two contrapuntal figures, la mochila and el paquetico. La mochila was launched on November 27th of 2017. It was hatched in the regime's cultural institutions. It was the government. It was what the government offered as an alternative to El Paquete, following a smear campaign that advocated for the prohibition of the latter. This contained, at first, a selection of material suggested or approved by the government's cultural elite, that is, intellectuals allied to the Communist Party. At the moment now that they have gotten over the ideological tantrum that made La Mochila a compendium of Fidel Castro's speeches and Telesur programs. They saw it as an opportunity and the need to disseminate what was being censored by the dictatorship's political police and the creators of El Paquete.
en materiales emitidos por los distintos grupos de la oposición dentro y fuera del país.
Materials that openly criticize the regime are distributed through the Paquetico. Content from blogs and independent media outlets censored by the government, as well as materials broadcasted by different opposition groups inside and outside the country.
Para actualizar al público sobre sus creaciones. Para este propósito les entregan a las matrices sus temas musicales y videoclips. Este modelo no es distinto
to this end, this model is not different from the use musicians and producers made of the radio during the development of music in England and the United States. The use of a specific medium always impacts the form of what is produced, thanks to the dynamics of consumption and circulation it imposes. In this sense, we can affirm that much of the music produced exclusively for the Paquete is modulated by it. The tiradera, diss track, the extra musical narrative that, like a meta-controversy, occurs between musicians, has found an idea, space, and rhythm in the Paquete and its weekly distributions. Cuban musicians based in Miami systematically sent over their complete records in order to keep the popularity they had earned in Cuba, at the expense of not receiving economic benefits. Today, the models they have ventured do not appear to consider the possibilities of the Paquete as a medium and operate by installing logic of legitimization, for example, adding section called art. The true impact of the Paquete Semanal is not in this context nor in their legitimacy. Its radical value lies in the anti-monopolistic character and forms of distribution and production that it promotes, all the more so considering it in a context dominated exclusively by one ideology, whose principal traits are the inconsistency of its ideas, hypocrisy, and opportunism, and the absolute control of the means of production and distribution. SNet. The second phenomenon of interest in the investigation is a clandestine community intranet IP that emerged in the beginning of the 2000s, which took shape and came to be known in the same SNet around the year 2011. In 2019, when it had more than 9 pillars central nodes and more than 30,000 people connected to it in Havana alone, it was forcefully taken over by the government institution known as the Joven Club de Computación, Your Computation Club. The first traces of this computer intranet, its first segments and nodes, appeared in the early 2000s. My own first contact with this practice occurred in 2003. A family member was part of one of the first networks in the Havana neighborhood of Monaco. The initiations were young people who had computers either because their family members traveled outside of the country or because the government had assigned them computers for work purposes, or because they had built them piece by piece in general with pieces stolen from the government or illegally brought into the country, creating small networks that were repeated all over the place. Although some of them had Wi-Fi cards built into the laptops of the era as well as AP access point devices, the common thing was to use cables. According to some of the participants, the first thought was to carry their computers, desktop mainly, from one host to another, but this cumbersome task got them into trouble with the police, who often confused them with sin with burglary. If you paid attention in those days, you could see the telephone lines hidden among the plants in people's gardens and yards that crossed from one another. Soon they crossed streets and avenues using utility poles and guiding themselves with the electrical connection of other cables. I maintain that the first enemies of SNet were the individuals illegally connected to the electric and telephone circuits. They used to say that the kids with their LAN networks will bring more attention from the inspectors and the police. The desire to play on equal terms drove these young people to help each other. In the early years, when the groups were limited to no more than 10 people, the players would pool their money or give each other duplicate pieces with the goal of making gaming conditions fair and leveling the playing field. StarCraft, as I have already mentioned, was the first game played on these networks. In news articles and academic texts dedicated to the growth of SNet, there are diagrams about the network's growth. The most precise models are the ones based on nodes and segments, but there is a tendency to present the growth radially. Circles or round shapes grow and meet until they overlap one another. The diagrams based on the radial growth echo the invasion narrative in StarCraft. Perhaps we could explore a parallel with the Zergs, one of the three principal organisms at war in the game, and especially with the reforms of expansion in relation to the mode of SNet expansion. CREEP, the viscous purple substance, whose primary expansion allows the Zergs to invade in the Simile, will be the ideal medium shaped by the minimum technological resources through which SNet could grow.
No todas las redes, pero por la disparidad de los recursos asimilaban igual el uso intenso ni la actividad de muchos jugadores, por lo que el crecimiento fue lento, trabajoso, viscoso, podemos decir. En la medida que los jóvenes se hicieron adultos,
in the beginning, many SNETs at different moments, networks began to merge with other networks. The edge of one CREEP dissolved as it met another. Not all of the networks, due to the disparity of resources, could equally stimulate the intense use and activity of many gamers. Growth was slowly difficult, viscous, as we could say.
También debe reconocerse que SNet fue para muchos un medio de aprendizaje, de difusión, de prácticas democráticas y autogestión comunitaria. La participación masiva de individuos de distintas formaciones.
The massive participation of individuals of different backgrounds and interests gave SNet unique traits beyond its communitarian character. For example, beginning in the network's second decade, each registered user was charged 1 CUC per month for a common fund meant for the purchase of new equipment to take on repairs or replacement due to wear or theft. The administration of this fund was public, and the table and explanations on the use of the funds were accessible. The administrative protocol became a means of teaching. The user understood the structure of the network and its needs, and learned about the necessary resources and means for the repair process. The volume of services offered, which has been partially recorded by some researchers, is a sign of the involvement of many users, spectators who became producers of content and digital tools for community interaction. The survival of SNet until 2019 was made possible through the deployment of common strategies. If it is true that the young founders, after going through university, brought technical and scientific knowledge back to the network, it was also that they brought their worries and personal experiences with regard to censorship and the ways the government punished dissent. As part of their way of negotiating with the government, some of the network's moderators agreed to establish rigorous rules that could only be violated once. Here aside a few of the most oft repeated rules: not talking about politics or religion, not offering services within the network, whether internet, television channels, pornography, or any type of service. That falls into illegality. Not charging ever for services offered on the network, not disrespecting other users of the network, no obscene language, no use of nicknames in a disrespectful manner or in a way that can lead to political misunderstanding. Before its absorption and dissolution by the state, SNet had 9 central pillars, whose networks cover large areas of Havana. Services and contents as diverse as clones of Facebook, social Havanas, sport and romantic forums, and selections of guides of passing university entrance exams were kept in the servers. A search for the network was developed to index all of the content, making the user's explorations easier. Material from the Paquete Semanal and an offline version of Revolico were also accessible within the network. In 2015, as part of the investigation, it was collaborated with an SNet administrator to understand the network's possibilities. A technician agreed to design a program that he inserted into the service of one of the nodes. The objective was to produce a collective text which resulted in the manner of an exquisite corpse in a poem of almost 3,000 words inserted by users over the course of a week. The poem, in addition to picking up the use of some words that belonged to the vocabulary of both government and the opposition, showed a recurrence of words in favor of the network's autonomy and survival. In 2019, the government began the definitive appropriation and dismantling of SNet. As usual, the process began with smear campaigns, simulated robberies, the provocation of infighting, legal accusations, and the political stigmatization of some of its administrators. The regime's Ministry of Telecommunications made clear that SNet was an institution of illegality. The law regulating Wi-Fi equipment only appealed to government companies, and the Decree of Law 171 from 1992 made its existence illegal. At the present, some of the users of SNet have accepted the conditions set by the government and have integrated themselves into the services that are now offered to them by the Youth Computation Block. These services can only exist on the infrastructure donated by SNet. As independent press picked up at the beginning of the summer of 2019, the officials of the Ministry of Telecommunications and the Youth Computation Club began to use the hashtags that previously victimized SNet's practices. For example, hashtag Red Comunitaria, hashtag CommunityNet. Organizers and SNet users utilize the tag hashtag Yo Soy Net, hashtag I am StreetNet to organize two peaceful protests. Revolico, during the 90s, as the country was becoming computerized, intranets were developed for Cuba's ministries and governmental companies. Some of these networks remained isolated, but others were connected to each other because of the companies that had created them belonged to the same ministries. Of many of these intranets, servers, lists, spreadsheets began to appear with offers and requests for objects and services. The creators of the list were computer technicians who needed to buy or sell computer pieces. Soon enough, the list became polluted with requests and offers for everyday services and objects. If someone needed to sell a motherboard or a piece of furniture or coffee, for example, they would access the server, find the file with the list, and insert their offer or request along with their personal information, phone number or address, and in some cases their email.
Pero el proceso que explicaré a continuación devino uno de los más importantes fenómenos en la Cuba de los últimos 15 años.
Between May and December of 2007, two Cuban computer science students developed the web page that allowed Cubans to offer and obtain goods and services. These young men, who were themselves avid users of the list, figured out that they could develop a protocol to categorize and thus organize the ever-growing content of the list. The process of absorbing content from the list only took 3 months because they quickly had a sufficient flow of offer and request entries from Cuba. By the time they launched Revolico.com in December of 2007, they could already do without the always scouted list. The operation was extremely clandestine. One of them traveled to Spain and set his post there while the other finished up his university degree. The domain Revolico.com was banned on the island. Solution to this issue of accessibility arose over 7 years. This site was hosted outside of Cuba because it was impossible to pay for website hosting in and from Cuba. In March 2008, a year after the start of the project, the government blocked access to the site for the first time. With the IP of Revolico.com service blocked on the island, users couldn't find the page when they typed the web address in the search bar. Revolico changed their IP, but the government blocked it again. The computer text behind these class fields site automated the IP change, programming the creation of a new one every hour. The government put an official in charge to block the IP each time, but they could not keep up, and the government did not find a way to deal with Revolico's solution until 2009. At the point that Cuba would connect to the global internet service through the use of the DNS configuration, the government's computer technicians were able to make it so that every time someone on the island typed Revolico.com, they were redirected to Google. Revolico then decided to create many distinct domain names and spread the word through their social media to access them. Users will have to email them to Revolico, and Revolico will send them a domain name. A few years later, an offline version of Revolico, which was updated weekly, began to circulate on SNet and via the Paquete Semanal. Revolico affects more just as a daily life in Cuba. For many researchers, it functions as an efficient tool for investigating and recording the island's material culture. Revolico can be read, consumed as as a storehouse of creative patterns. Through the use as well as the frequency of use of accepted terms, new research areas can be established. For a few years now, I have been using it to hitch description of vehicles for sale to one another. Through punctual and systematic searches, I have learned of many productive processes that are not visible outside this context.
Cuando este tipo de descripción se vuelve común en Revolico y rebasa el umbral de lo atípico para convertirse en norma, apunta a procesos.
I am selling a Fiat one.
Hace un año noté la presencia.
A year ago, I noticed the recurrent presence of the word claria. It is used as an allusion to a type of car. I was surprised to learn that it is a popular nickname to given in Cuba to a truck made by the Chinese manufacturer Great Wall Motors, GWM. The vehicle's durability, the adaptability of its parts, and the dynamic way these parts have invaded the mechanical system of other vehicles honor the invasive species of catfish from which they get their name. The claria haunts in the river streams, lagoons, reservoirs, and drainage systems of cities on the island. After the introduction by the government at the end of the 90s, the devilfish, as the Cuban santeros call them, scattered their breeding tanks due to the human hair and flooding provoked by hurricanes. This type of cannibal catfish possesses a modification to its respiratory system that allows it to remain on land and move outside of water. The term claria comes from the Greek claros and means living, animated. The word is now invading the descriptions and offers on Revolico. Trading Chevrolet 50 with Kia mechanics, Toyota differential with original emergency brake, Volga steering wheel, claria tires.
Cerramos esta conversación. Estoy llamándolo epílogo provisional. Cuando uno se dedica al estudio de la vida material en Cuba, del periodo de la Revolución, sabe que lidia con una producción que está condicionada por una ausencia absoluta de libertades cívicas, políticas y económicas. Desde este punto de vista, es difícil traer.
From this point of view, it's hard to bring back to the intuition the value of the practices that exist as an answer to a. This type of activities are considered a type of resistance for some sectors of the population of Cuba. These ones wouldn't exist if the conditions in Cuba for others, as the transformation of houses and as the urban spaces. The popular production in Cuba in the last decades defies the production of goods. On the other side, these creative practices exist as a confrontation to the limits and problems that accompany the capitalistic mercancies and the accessibility to technical systems. These goods many times unadequate to the uses in the island, for example. The popular productions of Cuba confronts many critics. For one side, it receives the stigmatization of the regime. The contradiction for example, doesn't apply
a las actividades llevadas a cabo por la población para confrontar, además del embargo, la ineficiencia y corrupción del propio gobierno. Es común también que todas las actividades culturales del régimen se empleen términos peyorativos para
all the instances of the regime is being used in pejorative terms.
Para los contenidos que circulan en el paquete semanal, la música urbana, pero también en la forma que se expresa la arquitectura transformada por sus habitantes, por citar tres de los campos de producción más dinámicos. Para algunos intelectuales y medios antagónicos,
for some intellectuals, outside of Cuba, all the cultural production of the island can be reunited as The incoherence of the government, it can be a fact that we cannot accept. This is the same intellectual critic charged with racism. It gives a much of possibility of
Lo que se ha instalado en Cuba es un capitalismo monopolista de Estado, en momentos de inversión en lo social, medidas populistas en su mayoría. Sin embargo, aplicar el término capitalismo monopolista de Estado al régimen cubano es dar carácter de Estado a la ocupación del poder.
We have this character of state that is a regimen of capitalism.
Pero serían demasiadas palabras cuando mafia es suficiente. Bueno, termino aquí.
But the sufficient words that I can use is mafia for this type of government.
No sé si tendríamos la oportunidad de tener una conversación con alguno de
I don't know if we have time to create a conversation here with the spectators, but anyway, I will remind you that tomorrow we will have a talk about any new Gráfica Cubana with Patricia and Julio Llovis. And I really look forward to seeing you all here, and thank you very much to Ms. Novera for the invitation. And I'm very happy to be here in the context of Documenta in this situation.